Let's talk about what we can learn from the reviews, initial impressions, and unboxings of Apple Vision Pro.
Something we call the Retina Display. What's that? Well, in any display there are pixels. We start off with the Retina Display by dramatically increasing the pixel density. 4 times as many pixels in the same amount of space. Now, why is that important? Well, let's make more pixels, and let's say we want to draw the letter A. Well, as you can see, we turn on pixels inside that stroke. We can get far more precision the more pixels we have. But when we zoom out of this, what you can see is that because we have 4 times as many pixels, we get really, really sharp text compared to what we normally get on displays of lesser resolution.
So the reviews of Apple Vision Pro came out this week, and I watched pretty much all of them and saw some common themes across the board. I watched them, I read them, and I saw 3 themes that I want to bring and talk to you about today. The 2 reviews that stood out to me the most were John Gruber's from Daring Fireball and Nilay Patel's from The Verge. We're going to color them in with MKBHD, maybe a little of iJustine if I can fit it in there, CNET, and more. But the 2 leading reviews that I want to kind of put in conversation with each other and myself are Gruber's and Nilay's. So let's start by quoting Gruber. He said that the hardware of the Vision Pro is limited. And this is the hardware theme that I noticed across the board. He says, the Vision Pro is a stake in the ground, defining the new state of the art in immersive headset technology. But that stake in the ground will recede in the rearview mirror as the years march on. Just like the Mac's 9-inch monochrome 512 by 342 pixel display, just like the iPhone's Edge cellular modem. His point that he was trying to make is that the hardware is there for the Vision Pro. The core of the hardware is good enough, but it's not great and it's not perfect. We've heard lots of complaints about the hardware, little bits of things here and there, of course exacerbated by Apple's over-the-top marketing, their classic over-the-top kind of head in the clouds type marketing. But his point is that Apple's head is in the clouds because they have a process. They've done this before. They've done it with the Mac. They did it with the iPod. They did it with the iPhone, especially with the Mac and the iPhone. I do want to call back to an earlier Gruber piece from 2010 where he talks about Apple's process here because I think it illuminates why he focuses on this in his review today. Here's what he said in 2010. This is how the designers and engineers at Apple roll. They roll. They take something small, simple, and painstakingly well considered. They ruthlessly cut features to derive the absolute minimum core product they can start with. They polish those features into a shiny intensity. At an anticipated media event, Apple reveals this core product as its next big thing and explains, no, wait. It simply shows how painstakingly thoughtful and well-designed this core product is. The company releases the product for sale. Then everyone goes back to Cupertino and rolls. As in, they start with a few tightly packed snowballs, and then they roll them into more snow. They roll them in more snow to pick up mass until they've got a snowman. That's how Apple builds its platforms. It's slow and steady processes of continuous iterative improvement. So slow, in fact, that the process is easy to overlook if you're observing it in real time. Only in hindsight is it obvious just how remarkable Apple's platform development process is. Gruber loves to do this. He has seen Apple and observed Apple professionally for decades now and knows that Apple's thing is that they roll. They start with something that they think of as sort of the minimum viable product, a kind of buzzword in Silicon Valley. And then they improve and iterate because they know the technology is going to improve and iterate. They start with a polished product, for sure, but a polished product that could use quite a bit more polishing, if that makes sense. This was common in basically all of the reviews. I could point to The Verge's review. I could go to Nilay. In fact, I will here. He says, the displays are the best in a VR headset, but that they're still imperfect. Quoting from him, he says, the problem is the cameras are still cameras and that the displays are still displays. They have issues. For example, he goes on to say that they have issues with motion blur, low light. Those are camera problems. Those are display problems, right? This is not something magical. He talks a lot about this idea about optical AR, which I suggest you watch their review in order to understand more about that. But the reality is that this device, as I've said before and as Nilay has said before, is a simulator of what Apple really wants to create. In CNET's review, in Gruber's review, back to Gruber's review, he goes on to say the same thing. He talks about the displays being excellent, but that they're not good enough. He says the eye tracking is good, but it's not as precise as he wants. The cameras are good, but they don't have the dynamic range of your eyes. And there's this color fringing that he and The Verge both bring up that happens along the edges of the lenses. That's just what happens because of the physics of the product. They've pushed the limits of the current technologies that we have. And so that's the first theme, that the product is there. The hardware is actually there in many ways, but there's a long way to go. It's a first generation product, no surprise. It's good, but it's not as good as it could be. Now, I want to close with two other points that I noticed. The hardware is so good and so beyond other headsets that there's one thing that I think distinguishes the Vision Pro from, let's say, any of Meta's headsets or anything that we've seen anywhere else, which is that text is easy to read. This is something that CNET commented on. This is something that Gruber has commented on. I've heard it on the Relay FM podcasts. But let me read from Gruber again. He says, I do not see pixels ever. I see text as crisply as I do in real life. And that's an important thing for Gruber. His whole day is spent in front of his devices reading text. So you know he'd have a discerning eye on top of the fact that he likes typography. But let me also read from CNET. It's CNET, and I'll have to add the name of the author here. Sorry, I didn't credit you. They say that this is the Retina moment for VR and AR. This was back when Steve Jobs was introducing the Retina display on the iPhone. How the display was pixel dense enough that from a certain distance, you could not make up each individual pixel in the display itself and what it was displaying. Now, this is especially kind of uncanny because text is what Jobs used as an exemplar for what a Retina display should do. So it's really no surprise that with that as the standard for an Apple display, that Gruber goes and remarks on how easy it is to read text. And I think that that's a really underrated piece of this piece of technology and why the Vision Pro is different and better than most other displays. It should be easy. It should be easy to read text. Now, let me close this off by talking about the weight, because this is something that everybody had issues with, right? Weight is an issue, and people made a big deal about this. But I think it's an issue for different reasons than other people have brought up. Yes, you want your neck to, not have to have a workout, or you don't need to stretch your neck at the end of the day and things like that. It's kind of a very Apple-y problem to put on this device. In fact, it's kind of funny that this device has that issue. But it's an issue because they pitch it as a device that you can get work done in with. And most people like to work in long, focused stretches. Now, if the headset's too heavy, it's going to prevent that. It might interrupt you in the middle of your flow. So it'll be very important and very interesting to see how that plays out. Here's what Nilay said. The headset alone weighs substantially more than an 11-inch iPad and gets close to the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. In a very real way, this is an iPad on your face.
They have those huge goggles you can wear.
But they're lousy.
But you never get a date if you ever wear them, right? So
the second theme here is all about personalization and isolation. Again, I'll let Gruber set the tone. He said that Vision Pro is an extraordinarily personal device. I think that's true. He was talking about it in relation to the kind of like motorization of the pupillary distance of the lenses inside the display. He was talking about the fit of it on your head, everything else. But I think he was using it as kind of a gesture towards how personal this device is. I think Apple called the watch the most personal device they'd ever made when they made it. That was because it was something you'd wear. This is very similar in that sense. Something you wear has to inherently be very personal. That said, as devices get more personal, they also get more isolating. Early computers, right, were these things that you would visit in a communal space, give your programs to someone else to run on the computer, and then get it back from another human being. That's crazy, right? Then maybe the next iteration would be a personal computer in your home, right? A little further removed from the community, isolated to your family. And then we each got individual personal computers, right? Further isolating us from these communal spaces where we would use these computing devices. Of course, that only gets closer and closer to us. And as those screens get closer and closer to us, we get more and more isolated from the rest of the group. The Vision Pro is just about as close as you can get, right? It literally covers your eyes. And Nilay hits on this huge in his review at The Verge. Here's what he says. Using the Vision Pro is such a lonely experience, regardless of the weird eyes on the front and the uncanny valley personas that you have in there, having experiences all by yourself that no one else can take part in. That's kind of the core of it. When you are in the Vision Pro, you have a literal reality covered with apps or movies or environments or whatever else that no one else is sharing. And they can't really share in most ways. And that is inherently isolating. But I think the thing that exemplifies it best is the personas feature. Let me go ahead and read again from Gruber. Personas are weird. They're very deep in the uncanny valley. My hair, for example, looks like a shiny plastic Lego hairpiece, right? But the next two reviews, and everyone touched on how kind of uncanny and weird these personas were. The personas are the things that let you use the Vision Pro on FaceTime, right? If you had an external camera and you were wearing the Vision Pro, you'd have this thing covering your eyes while you were on a FaceTime call. So a persona is just this 3D recreation of yourself. You literally hold it in front of you and let it scan your face as you go. And then it creates this 3D representation, an avatar of you that they call a persona, and then lets other people on the FaceTime call see this 3D projection of you into their world by reading your facial movements, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your facial expressions. It's very uncanny, very Black Mirror in its own, and they look like these NPC kind of like very depersonalized thing. Let me read from MKBHD's, some of the transcript of MKBHD's review and first impressions. He first starts by talking about the EyeSight feature, which is powered by the persona. So the persona is used for these FaceTime, these front-facing camera type video conferencing platforms, and they're also used for the EyeSight feature, which is the feature that lets you see someone's eyes through the headset. What that does is it takes the same facial tracking and puts that 3D persona, the eyes, on the front of the display because you can't see through it, right? There's a whole bunch of computer between you and the real world. And this is what MKBHD says. It looks nothing like the eyes from the ad. Later he says, it barely shows up. You can barely see my eyes when I'm wearing the headset. I've tried a couple of other scans, different lighting conditions, different backgrounds, simple backgrounds, different shirts, etc. It doesn't ever appear brighter. I think if you have a darker skin tone like me, just don't expect that the eyes will show up very brightly on the outside of the headset, which brings up all sorts of questions, right, about this feature. He finishes by saying that he feels like this is both incredibly impressive and slightly unsettling. So again, we're back to this isolation, personalization tension. Let me finish by showing you this clip from Joanna's review at the Wall Street Journal, because this, I can't do it justice by reading it.
And when I FaceTime people looking like this, it was universally agreed upon.
I think you look awful.
It's like
Botox from hell.
So they did you so dirty, Joe.
You could see people's reactions there, right? They literally could not believe what they were seeing. They felt like Joanna's persona completely misrepresented who she was. What is more isolating and in some ways more personal than that? Now, it's interesting because these personas power FaceTime, right? They replace the front-facing camera. And MKBHD had this interesting piece in the video where he talked about a couple of very futuristic feelings he got while he was in the device. And one of them was FaceTime. He says, FaceTime is the most well thought out, like the most futuristic Vision Pro experience. That's interesting, that FaceTime is an exemplar of what spatial computing could be and just how communal that is.
We're going to talk about three things today. You know, if the hardware is the brain and the sinew of our products, the software in them is their soul.
All right, let's bring this home. We're going to talk about my hobby horse, spatial computing, and we're going to let Gruber set the tone one more time. The worlds, as it were, of macOS and iOS, or Windows or Android or whatever, are defined and limited by the displays on which they run. If macOS is a place I go mentally when working, that place is manifested physically by the Mac's display. It's like playing on a field or the court in sports. It has very clear, hard and fast rectangular bounds. It is of fixed size and shape, and everything I do in that world takes place in the confines of those display boundaries. visionOS is very much going to be a conceptual place like that for work, but there is no display. There are no boundaries. The intellectual place where the apps of visionOS are presented is the real world place in which you use the device, or the expansive virtual environment that you choose. The room in which you're sitting is the canvas, the whole room. The display on a Mac or iOS device is, to me, like a portal, a rectangular window into a well-defined virtual world. With visionOS, the virtual world is the actual world around you. I think that captures the essence of this device. And it's no surprise that it comes from Gruber. visionOS kind of turns your world into a video game in some ways. It allows you to place digital objects literally seamlessly in your space. There's very little distinction between the two beyond what you're allowed to control with a pinch and a gaze versus what you have to physically move with your hands. Later on, Gruber goes to talk about how AR and VR are subsets of spatial computing, which I think is a very accurate description. But the important piece is that you now no longer have to look through a window into Alice's Wonderland. You step into Alice's Wonderland. Apps are the thing that define visionOS because there's really no device. I mean, you're wearing a headset, yes, but the device is not what's primary to you anymore. You're not staring at something. You're staring at apps. Apps are crucial for this thing. Apps are spatial computing, really. Let's go ahead and turn to The Verge because Nilay does a good job talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages that Apple has here. So he starts by noting that visionOS is an evolved version of iPadOS. He has that confirmed from Apple. It's very interesting that that's the case, first of all. You know that I've talked in the past about the idea of the MultiPad lifestyle, that in the past, in order to get these digital pieces of paper out into the real world, you might have to buy a Mac and an iPad and an iPad mini and an iPad Pro. You'd have to buy a bunch of different things and lay them all out like pieces of paper, spread out to work. But with visionOS, the apps are spread out. You are working in a spread out manner almost inherently. That visionOS is the manifestation of the MultiPad lifestyle that some people have tried to use, and many people have imagined before. Think Picard on the Starship Enterprise, or any science fiction, Tony Stark in his lab, any science fiction that you can think of that where people are throwing things here and there. It's not revolutionary for me to say this, but people thought it was a little crazy when you did it with multiple iPads, but it's going to be inherent in visionOS. Now, Nilay goes on to say that starting with the iPad as a foundation is an incredible head start for Apple. It's taken years for Meta to build out all the features of Quest OS and populate its app store, and it's still mostly just games. Apple gets to start with the full set of iPadOS features and most of the huge iPad app library. Think about that. I know that we've talked in the past about certain developers that haven't put their apps on this device, but for everyone who is, and for the user, you're going to be able to lay essentially an infinite number of iPads in the infinite space that you have, really spreading out these digital pieces of paper wherever you can. And Apple gets to do that from the jump. Now, iPad's sort of breadth of apps is much smaller than iPhone's, but the point is still there. This device might already be bootstrapped. And I think it's hugely foundational in terms of whether or not Vision Pro is going to be successful in the market. So if apps are so key here, it's also interesting to me that Gruber ends up focusing on how visionOS really does make those apps stable in the real world. This is something multiple people mentioned, that it's kind of almost shocking how real it feels that these apps are. Like, I can place an app in the other room and then leave, go to the kitchen and make something, and go back and my app is still there. They become these almost physical objects. They have the actual physicality or spatiality to them, I guess, that you probably are not very familiar with other than with an actual physical device. But let's kind of close this section talking about spatial computing in a way that I think represents some of the issues and all of the greatness that this device encapsulates. The rough edges, the big visions, the spatial computing of it all. From The Verge. The first few times you use hand and eye tracking on the Vision Pro, it's awe-inspiring. It feels like a superpower. The next few times you use hand tracking and eye tracking and it stops feeling like a superpower. And in some cases, it actively makes using the Vision Pro harder because it's forcing you to look at what you want to control, and that's actually very distracting. Paraphrasing a little bit there. MKBHD noticed this as well. He says, the biggest adjustment is only being able to control exactly what you're looking at. It takes a few extra brain cycles to remember to always be looking at exactly the thing you're controlling. That's a little rough. That's actually one of the biggest indictments of this device that I can think of. That the fundamental human-computer interaction, look and tap, that is something that requires extra thought. Now, you could say the same thing about the click and point, or the point and click of a mouse, or the tap and swipe of the iPhone. But I think that this is a little different. If these experienced tech nerds, let's be honest, are saying that this is taking time for them to think about what it is that they have to do to interact with these devices, that does not bode well for me in terms of what that device actually is going to be capable of in the long run. So there you go. Long day for me in the office here, reading, reviewing, highlighting, clipping. My thoughts are a little bit everywhere on this, but there were a few through lines. Again, the first one being that the hardware is great. It is the best that there is. Everybody said that, but that there's still rough edges. The second one, that there's this deep personalization of the device. It is the most personal device that there maybe possibly could be. But it's also isolating and a little rough around the edges. The last one, spatial computing. You know, this is my hobby horse. I said it before, I'll say it again. It's gonna be groundbreaking. I think it is groundbreaking. But fundamentally, even the most fundamental things, the human-computer interaction, the input device, is a little rough around the edges. And that is unsurprising, really. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a bit of a letdown that all these reviews basically said these same things. It's a first-gen product. It's a first-gen product. But Apple's going to keep rolling. They're going to keep rolling. And so will the rest of the industry, to be honest. I do want to make one little bit of a note here at the very end and talk about the entertainment experience, because everybody talked about the entertainment experience too. This is a little bit of a coda, a little bit of a dessert at the end here. A lot of people have said that the entertainment aspect of this device maybe is worth it on its own. In fact, The Verge, here's what Nilay says: you can get pretty far making the argument that the Vision Pro is worth it simply as a very expensive TV. This is a man who loves TVs. Here's what Gruber said: the Vision Pro is simply a phenomenal way to watch movies, and 3D immersive experiences are astonishing. There's 3D immersive experiences in Vision Pro that are more compelling than Disney World attractions that people wait in line for hours to see. I can recommend buying Vision Pro solely for use as a personal theater. This hits on a lot of the things, right? Extremely personal, spatial computing, great hardware, great displays. It makes sense that this device is great for entertainment. And I think it's very interesting that these two reviewers, and actually many of them, have come around to say, oh my God, this thing is good as an entertainment device on its own. We've talked before about how the iPod was really an app in itself. I don't know that Vision Pro's killer app is going to be watching movies and TV shows and 3D immersive experiences on its own. But at the beginning, that might be enough to turn some heads. And maybe that's enough.